The man who murdered a highly respected doctor in Toronto more than 2 years ago got his sentence today. Mohammed Shamji is going to be in prison for at least 14 years. Shamji is also a doctor and the husband of Elana Fric. Shamji pleaded guilty last month to second-degree murder for killing Fric while their 3 children slept. A life sentence is automatic. Only the parole eligibility had to be determined today. Crown and defense agreed on 14 years. Outside the courthouse, Elana Fric's mother said there is no punishment that can make up for the loss of her daughter. She spoke about how difficult the years since her daughter's murder have been for her and her grandchildren.
For 2.5 years, we have waited for Mo to accept a responsibility for something we knew he has done from the day one, knowing that the eldest daughter will be an important witness because she ran into the bedroom when she heard a mother scream and later heard the thumping of the heavy suitcase going down the stairs. I live in a constant fear of her life and safety all those years, not knowing what length he will go to for his own selfish goals, including disposing of witness. Poor was forced to testify a full day of preliminary inquiry. What father will do that to his daughter? She was full of anxiety for another full year, that knowing she will have to testify at trial. There was no penalty that this court could give him that will ever justify what Mo has done to Elana, to us, and especially to the children. The children still cannot bear to have their mother maintained because it's so painful to them. At this time of year, everywhere they turn, they see memories of Mother Day, and that is only make their pain worse. Instead of making cards and trinkets for the mother, they lay flowers to her grave. Little stuck to her painting on the mother wall and talked to her in her graveside. In my heart, I will always believe that was a premeditated act of first-degree murder, but I knew that the law required fuller beyond responsible doubt, and we do not have that proof, and Mo has not admitted, so we have to accept what has come to become. We have no other choice.
The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick was in the courtroom in Toronto and joins us live. So what did the judge have to say in passing this sentence, Megan?
Well, Andrew, he outlined the reasons going into his decision, both the mitigating and the aggravating factors that go into sentencing. And as for the mitigating factors, he talked about Shamji's character, talking about how he was known as a skilled neurosurgeon who saved many people's lives. But then the judge also said that's quite a juxtaposition with the fact that he took his own wife's life. But he did say he had no prior criminal record. He also pointed to the fact that Shamji did plead guilty to second-degree murder last month, sparing the family a trial, which he said would have been extremely painful and part of the ongoing nightmare that the family's already been going through for the last 2.5 years, particularly for the 14-year-old daughter who was scheduled to testify against her own father because of what she heard that night, as you heard her grandmother describe there in that clip. And the justice said that that would have been the worst possible scenario he could have imagined for the daughter, having to testify against her own father in the murder case of her mother. So he was given essentially some credit for the guilty plea, but the judge also noted that guilty plea only came last month, Andrew, 2.5 years after he was charged with the murder. But Shamji did also issue an apology and show some remorse in court yesterday during the victim impact statement part of ahead of that victim impact statements that were also read in court. He apologized directly to his 3 children and expressed regret for what he had done. The judge also talked about Elana Fric and her character as an aggravating factor, talking about how she was so loved, how she was so smart and brilliant, was a dedicated doctor and considered a rising star in her field. He also talked about the fact that this was a case of domestic violence, how Elana Fric was abused by her husband physically and emotionally, and that the sentence must reflect that kind of crime. And Andrew, one of the detectives that worked on this case also spoke about that to reporters outside the courthouse. Take a listen to what he said.
It's one of the most heinous and serious crimes that often get committed behind closed doors and people don't know about it. And that's where I think it's very important as adults, as citizens, that if we recognize abuse, if you recognize somebody who's going through it, you need to speak to the authorities and you need to bring it to somebody's attention that can take action. Because often we believe that somebody's going to do it, but nobody ends up doing it. And that's where it's a collective responsibility.
The judge also talked about the nature of the murder, Andrew, how violent it was, the steps that Shamji took afterwards to cover it up. But he did say that he agreed with the recommendation from the Crown and the defense attorneys for the 14 years parole eligibility. He said that's not too lenient, it's not too excessive. He viewed it as a just and fair punishment, that he would be eligible to apply for parole in 14 years, not necessarily get it, but apply for it. As he sentenced Shamji, he rose in the courtroom. Andrew, he was wearing a suit. He stared straight ahead. And when it was all over, he was let out of the courtroom in handcuffs.
So the judge gave Shamji credit for pleading guilty, partly explaining the sentence. So what did Fric's family think of that?
They're not really impressed by that. They are not satisfied with this verdict of 14 years. But again, as you heard in that clip, they're not going to be satisfied with any penalty, they said. Her mother, Elana's mother, Anna, spoke to reporters at length after the hearing was over, detailing their marriage and the abuse that her daughter suffered. She said she urged her daughter to leave the marriage many times. They didn't accept the apology from Shamji in court the way the judge did. Let's listen to what she said about that.
I don't accept either. He did it for himself. Only for himself, to save himself. He doesn't care for nobody, not for children. I can also say it, he never lived a one penny for the children, okay? Never. He didn't care for them before, he don't care now. He only cared for himself. That's the main purpose that what he said yesterday, to be less sentence.
They were very emotional, often wiping away tears. Her parents, as well as her sister, Elana's sister, was here at the court as well. Part of the sentencing also included ordering Shamji not to have any contact with his children without consent. And the grandparents who are now looking after the three children, Andrew, they are satisfied with that, saying they think that was the right thing to do for the judge to make that order. The two older daughters were in the courtroom today as well, and the grandmother saying she hopes that's the last time Shamji ever sees them, but she did say too, when those children grow up, it will be up to them to decide what contact, if any, they have with their father.
Megan, thank you. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick live in Toronto. As we mentioned, Mohammed Shamji was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 14 years. For more on the sentence, I'm joined by Karen MacArthur. She's a criminal defense lawyer in Toronto. So, Karen, what do you make of the sentence?
Well, it's not that he received a sentence of 14 years. He's received a life sentence for his guilty plea to second-degree murder. He is eligible for parole at 14 years. That means that he can start the process. That by no means that he will be out at 14 years. Do I view the sentence as just and appropriate given the domestic nature of the crime? The judge did, the Crown did, and the defense did. And I think it's important for the viewers to know it was probably hammered out. The 14 years was worked out in the judge's chamber. It's a fit sentence given sentencing principles in Canada. Hard for the Fric family to understand, hard for many people to understand, but it is a fit sentence having regard to the sentencing principles.
Yeah, I guess that's what it was, because we also heard from Elana's mother, and she said,
she's
you know
horrified.
What? She's horrified, and she said, it's my right to say this. I wish there were the death penalty because that's what he deserved. And
an eye for an eye is bringing it from her, you know? And she's left caring for these three children, and she'll never get her daughter back.
So what kind of factors do you think came into play in this decision, in that 14-year, no eligibility for parole for 14 years?
So Judge McMahon looked at both the aggravating, which are the horrifying facts, and the mitigating facts. The most mitigating fact here is that a trial didn't happen, and the eldest daughter who heard her mom crying in the next room and then went in and she wasn't there, didn't have to testify. So she is spared that. That's the biggest mitigating, the aggravating factor is what he did after killing his wife, going about his normal business, going into the operating room and getting rid of her. All of that was considered by Justice McMahon, and he came in with 14 years. And as I say, that was worked out, I believe, behind the scenes on consent, as it were.
So what about a guilty plea last month, 2.5 years after the murder?
Well, it's a little late in coming, but certainly before the defendant enters the guilty plea, the defense lawyer has to get familiar with all of the disclosure and see if there are any possible defenses, and then seek instructions from the defendant. It is a late guilty plea, but it's a guilty plea nonetheless.
What did you make of the detective who said, you know what, these are among the most serious and heinous crimes. They happen behind closed doors, and sometimes people don't speak up, that you need to speak up. You think someone else will speak up, and then they don't.
I really appreciated what Detective Singh had to say about us being our brother's keeper, or in this circumstance, being our sister's keeper. If you're out and about and you see a suggestion that there's violence or abuse or intimidation, there's everything to be gained from reaching out and speaking to who it is that you believe may be in a difficult situation. We live in a society, and we should be more mindful of protecting each other. Be our brother's keeper, be our sister's keeper. We might end up without having as many of these horrific domestic violence cases as we do see. Many women across our country are killed on an annual basis. I think last year there were 574 women killed at the hands of their domestic partners.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
What do you make of that there will be that the children will not be allowed to see their father without consent, and that the grandmother saying that they hope that the last time they saw their father would be in that court?
So that's a typical type of condition to impose at a sentencing hearing in these circumstances, given that these 3 children had their mother ripped out of their lives. I think it's an appropriate condition to impose. When the girls turn 18, they can make their own decision about that. I heard what Mrs. Fric had to say about no way, no how under her watch would those girls have any contact with their father, and you understand where she's coming from.
And so then that means because she has custody that she will not provide the consent until they're of age?
Right, she's the decision maker right now.
Okay. The judge also ruled that he must submit DNA. What would that be used for?
To see if he's committed any other crimes, either in the past or in the future. So it's kept in the DNA data bank. That is part of the criminal code. People that are convicted of crimes of violence have to submit for DNA. It's an additional crime-fighting tool, similarly to how we collect fingerprints.
What do you say to those who are watching, and I've heard it a lot today, who they hear the life sentence, but it's back to what we started at the beginning. They hear that. No, they hear, eligible for parole. It doesn't mean he'll get parole, but after 14 years, and they just kind of shake their heads, and the idea of it, to them, to many, is horrifying that someone like him, given what he did, could be out of jail in 14 years.
The idea is repugnant to many of the viewers, to many Canadians. I understand that. What I say is that there's always the chance for redemption. What Mr. or Dr. Shamji did was done at the worst possible moment of his life. He is now being judged for doing the worst possible thing he's ever done in his life, one presumes. But he had many other golden moments or good moments throughout his life. I understand that at the sentencing hearing, many of his colleagues and former patients came forward to say positive things about him. This was an isolated, ugly, crazy moment in the man's life, which is why he was able to enter a plea to second-degree murder as opposed to first-degree murder, which would have been planned and deliberate. The second-degree murder speaks to the fact that this was in a moment of frenzy when he and his wife were arguing and fighting. So what I say to the viewers is he's been sentenced for an episodic, ugly act of violence, arguably out of character, for his life, and that there is the chance of redemption and rehabilitation. And if he does follow through with that and the parole board sees that he is safe to live in the community, they are the ones that can make that decision. Being eligible for parole still leaves the decision-making in the hands of the parole board.
All right, Karen, appreciate your insight. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Karen MacArthur is a criminal defense lawyer based here in Toronto.